afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 7th Jeju Forum. My name is Lee Ju-hee. I'll be the host for the announcement of the declaration of Jeju Forum. Thank you very much. I would like to thank our distinguished guests for joining us despite busy schedules. And we will now begin the announcement of the declaration of Jeju Forum. And we are now going to invite Governor Oh Young-un of Jeju Special Self-Governing Province for the declaration. Please welcome His Excellency. Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Oh Young-un, the Governor of Jeju Special Self-Governing Province. And I do see many familiar faces, and I feel so nice. It feels great to be able to meet such friendly faces. We have Mr. Lee Gyu-bae, the chairperson of the board of the Jeju 4 April 3 Research Institute, as well as the president of the same institute. And I will also see the family members of those that have passed away as a result of the Jeju April 3 incident. Good afternoon. I am Young-un Oh, the committee chair for the Jeju Forum 2022 and the governor of Jeju Special Self-Governing Province. The 7th Jeju Forum was held for 3 days, and the final curtain is now coming down. I offer my heartfelt appreciation to all of you who are here today with us. The 2022 Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity was being held under the theme Beyond Conflict Towards Peace, Coexistence, and Cooperation. The intellectuals from all over the world gathered here to discuss ways to surmount a crisis, including COVID-19, climate change, and the new Cold War that threatens humanity and international order. In addition, the forum served as a venue where they could discuss how to achieve peace and prosperity for all countries. My special thanks go to leaders and officials from home and abroad who helped us to successfully complete our forum. And I also want to thank a resident of Jeju Island. This year marks the 17th anniversary of Jeju Forum, and it was the first international event organized by the new 8th Jeju Special Self-Government Provincial Office. And today I would like to suggest directions to the future made by Jeju Special Self-Governing Province with Peace and Cooperation Declaration. Distinguished guests and my fellow Jeju residents, here today I will declare the globalization of April 3 incident. Jeju residents have defended the spirit of reconciliation, coexistence, peace, and human rights, overcoming historical tragedies for the past 70 years. April 3 incident will be realized as an exemplary model to resolve past history so that those values can be spread universally. The model will help us to open up a new future full of hope. The forum's session speakers and foreign press recognized that the model's spirit of reconciliation and coexistence can help the world to resolve past history and can enable different countries to cooperate in the era of post-COVID-19 and a new Cold War. Jeju Special Self-Governing Provincial Office will pursue the globalization of April 3 incident and enhance the international value of Jeju Island as an island of peace. To do so, we will come up with trauma recovery indicator until the end of this year to set an exemplary model that transcends conflicts and protects peace. There has not been an international indicator related to recovery of trauma resulting from state violence and past history. Therefore, The TRI will be the world's first case that suggests a model to resolve past experiences and achieve justice, reconciliation, and recovery. I will spare no efforts to promote it as UN global indicator, and then other countries will be able to use it as a model to solve their past historical issues. Furthermore, I will devise various ways to help invaluable records of April 3 incident to be inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage list. The records not only contain historical facts of our victims, but also they can play a key role in pursuing reconciliation and coexistence for future generation and solidarity and cooperation to lead world peace. By promoting April 3 incident as a leading model for seeking reconciliation, coexistence, and peace and human rights, we will move on to another chapter. The future of April 3 incident will be bright and hopeful, overcoming the dark history. As the world is facing several challenges from pandemic, from a climate crisis, for the future, we believe that global cooperation and solidarity is needed. And we will increase international cooperation. And in terms of economy, tourism, and culture, we will promote exchanges so that we will all be prosperous together. First and foremost, by leveraging our geological advantages, we will find new opportunities in ASEAN region and in the Arab world. By expanding our network, we will strengthen the cooperation with other countries to protect peace. In addition, by focusing on Jeju ASEAN Plus Alpha policy, people-to-people exchange, and exchange of material resources will increase in various sectors from economy to culture and arts to tourism. These projects will help us to expand exchange and enhance our understanding with ASEAN countries and Arab countries in the Arabic region. But also it will lay a foundation to usher in a new Tamna era, the golden age Jeju enjoyed in the past. Distinguished guests, all of our efforts will help us to move from conflict to peace and serve as a starting point for new cooperation in a new Cold War era. Let us leverage our wisdom and insights to build a community where people and nature can be pleased. I am looking forward to make a global life of community where dignity of human and peace and human rights are protected so that all humanity can enjoy living together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Governor Oh Young-woon has mentioned the spirit of reconciliation, coexistence, and peace has made Jeju Declaration. Please give another big round of applause for the Governor Oh Young-woon. I hope that we can indeed open a new era of cooperation. Governor Oh has mentioned the globalization of April 3rd incidents. And next, we would like to begin the Resolving Korea's Past History, Jeju April 3rd, and International Solidarity, Efforts for Peace and Coexistence session. And with that, we would like to invite our governors of Jeju April 3rd Research Institute. Please welcome him with a big hand. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity 2022. We'd like to begin the Resolving Korea's Past History, Jeju, April 3rd, and International Solidarity, Efforts for Peace and Coexistence. I am Han Ji-hee, Secretary General of Jeju, April 3rd Research Institute. We would like to take a moment of silence. Everybody, please stand up. For the April 3rd
모두 자리에
Thank you. Please take your seat. Next, we would like to invite Chairman Lee Gyube of Jeju April 3rd Research Institute for the opening speech. Please welcome Lee Muda.
안녕하십니까.
Good afternoon. As was introduced, I am Chairman of the Board Lee Gyube of Jeju April 3rd Research Institute. This is being live streamed, so I cannot talk on and on, but there is something that I must tell you. Just like Biden, the poet said, I woke up this morning and I got suddenly popular, he said. I didn't know that Jeju April 3rd Research Institute would be able to stand up in this prestigious forum. In that regard, I would like to thank all the organizers of this forum. And also, I would like to thank Governor Oh Young-hoon for giving a special attention to the April 3rd incident. I didn't expect that we would have Jeju Declaration here. And in that declaration, you mentioned globalization of April 3 multiple times. 70 years ago, we lost so many people here in this Jeju island. And there are a lot of bereaved families of the victims who still carry shadows of that tragedy. And I believe all those people are dreaming for globalization of April 3rd incident. On the 70th anniversary, in front of the Gwanghwamun area of Seoul, we cried out, April 3rd incident is now the part of the history of Korea with a big placard. If we can realize what was envisioned in the Jeju Declaration, we can say that the April 3rd incident will be the beginning point of the global history. We are here today because we relate to the value of Jeju April 3 Research Institute. 70 years ago, in this island as small as a bean, we had rebels as tiny as a grain of millet, according to a testament. In this small island, why did we have to kill so many people? Why did so many people have to die? Bereaved families of the victims, even today, ask why my family members had to die, but nobody is providing with us an answer. It seems like nothing if we look back. In this small island, why did we have to have this bloodshed? One writer from the Athens said that however how much water is poured, we cannot erase the remnants of the bloodshed. Behind this death, I believe that there must have been an invisible hand. And about that invisible hand, we named it. We have given it a name, and the name is imperialism. An activist and the advocate, Nakano Toshio, is invited to provide a keynote speech here in this session. And we also have invited Professor John Eberjesse for his speech. And we would like to talk about the imperialistic path taken by the United States and Japan. And we would like to see if we can find an answer or if we can open our door to the truth of what happened 70 years ago here in this Jeju Island. This will soothe so many sorrows because finally, if then, we will be able to find an answer to why so many people had to die. I hope that we can find and dig out the background, context, and more importantly, truth behind what happened here in this Jeju Island. And if you agree, please do stay with us till the end. Thank you so much.
네, 감사합니다.
Yes, thank you very much. Now we're going to invite back Governor Oh Young-un of Jeju Special Self-Governing Province to give us his congratulatory remarks. Let's welcome His Excellency. I seem to be on stage quite often here today, so my apologies for that. Well, I want to thank President Han In-taek of Jeju Peace Institute, and I would like to thank members of Jeju Council and the distinguished leaders of Jeju Province for being with us here today. And I think it's very meaningful for us to hold a closing session of the 17th Jeju Forum under the theme of moving towards righteous solutions of Jeju April 3rd incident. I would like to thank Chairman Lee Gyu-bae and President Ho Young-sun of Jeju April 3rd Research Institute for their contribution in hosting this session, which will be looking at international solidarity for Jeju of April 3rd and other important unresolved historical events in the Korean history. I would like to thank the moderator, Ha Ho-jun of Hangyeore, keynote speaker, Professor Nakano Toshio of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, speakers, panelists, and the audience, and most of all, the families of those that lost their lives during the Jeju April 3 incident. Jeju April 3rd incident will be an exemplary model for resolving past atrocities and tragedies with the values of reconciliation, coexistence, peace, and human rights. Jeju Special Self-Governing Province will protect the much cherished values of Jeju April 3rd incident and incorporate the values into the future of the new Sunurum community and into the wider world. And the provincial government will endeavor to have Jeju April 3rd incident records to be listed as UNESCO Memory of the World and will provide education about the incident so that the spirit of Jeju April 3 incident can be shared around the world. I hope that this last session of this year's Jeju Forum will be a forum of deeper dialogue that will help to promote the values of peace and human rights and of interactions that can strengthen international solidarity for sustained peace and coexistence. In terms of resolving the past issues, so-called rectification of names, and determining the responsibility of the U.S. military government still remain. However, the experiences and lessons learned from Jeju April 3 incident, I am sure will help to build lasting peace. And I want to thank you once again for your presence. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful remark. Moving on, we would like to invite Professor Nakano Toshio for his keynote speech. Let us invite Professor Nakano up to the stage. Please welcome him with a big hand. He is a Professor Emeritus of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies and is an expert of the April 3rd incident. He is also a member of a group which remembers the April 3rd incident and pays a lot of attention to the incident. Please, the floor is yours.
여러분 안녕하십니까?
Good afternoon. I am Nakano Toshio and I'm from Tokyo. It is my great pleasure to be here. Today, I would like to talk about the April 3rd incidents in the East Asian history. That is the title of my presentation. I'm sorry that I will speak in Japanese in my lecture. Thank you. I ask for your understanding. With that, let us begin this presentation. With the title of April 3rd Incident in the East Asian History, I would like to begin my presentation. If you look at the East Asian history, as was put by Governor Oh, I think we have to think about the imperialism and colonialism. We have to think about the relations between the incidents with the imperialism and colonialism. If you look at the map here on the slide, as you're well aware, the April 3 incident, third incident, came out of the division of the Korean Peninsula. And if you look at the division of the Korean Peninsula from the East Asian point of view, you can view it like this map. This division comes from the divide and rule of the Japanese Empire, which lost the war. On the right, you have a map of Japan. The Japanese Empire, to be more specifically. The division was basically an imperialistic fight over the hegemony and the divide and rule of the Japanese Empire. That is why we have to look at the imperialism and colonialism if we are to look at the April 3rd incidents. If you look at this cartoon, when we think about the colonialization and imperialism, we have to begin thinking about these issues from the Russia-Japan War. There was this French painter, and he drew this cartoon satirizing the Russia-Japan War. And you can see a Russian cooking a maroon, and a boy who appears to be Japanese is trying to steal the pot. But I hope you can see the two gentlemen standing behind the Japanese boy. There is a UK gentleman and the United States gentleman. The Japanese is trying to fight against Russia, but you can see that the US and the UK were nudging Japan to fight against Russia instead of them, on behalf of them basically. So I want you to think about the Russia-Japan war and the process of it. The war was declared in February 1904, and because of the Kasura-Taft Agreement and the Russia-Japan Portsmouth Treaty, the war was put to an end. And in between, there were a lot of mutual recognition agreements. On the right, you can see the picture of the Prime Minister Katsura Taro and the picture of the Special Envoy Taft. They signed a mutual recognition agreement. And under this mutual recognition agreement, Japan could rule Korea and the United States could rule the Philippines. And also, the existing UK-Japan alliance was revised in August 1905. And after revision, Japan could rule Korea. And under the revision, the UK was given this right to rule India under this mutual recognition agreement. What does this mean? The colonization of the Korean Peninsula cannot be seen in an isolated manner. The Korea, Philippine, and Indian colonization took place because of the imperialism of Japan, the United States, and the UK. So in this big picture, we have to think about how colonialism unfolded. If you look at these three figures, you can see the imperialistic relations between the United States and the UK. And this picture shows that this imperialistic trend and movement is deeply related to the expansion of colony of Japan. Japan's southward advance was met by the US and UK imperialism, and what led to confrontation. And you can see that in the 1930s, Japan mandated the South Sea Islands, and the Manchukuo was set up as a puppet government. And if you look at the map in the middle, to secure resources, Japan tried to occupy the British Malay and Dutch Indonesia, and also to win hegemony, the Japan tried to liberalize the British Burma and the American Philippines. This structure of the war, like power of the war and the conflict of the power led to the war. I want to here pay attention to southward advance. It was not just a mere expansion of territory, this overhauled the social and economic structure of Japan. Please take a look at this table. You can see the changes in the export and import composition of Japan from the 1910s and 1930s. If you can see the table, Japan used to export raw silk yarn. The major export item used to be raw silk yarn. But then, by the 1930s, things changed. The number one export item became textiles. What does this mean? The export and import composition had changed. The raw silk yarn was replaced by textiles as the number one export item, and the export market changed from the United States to Asia, and the import item changed as well. The cotton, pulp, wool, raw rubbers. So basically, ingredients became, or the raw materials became the main import item. So through 1910s, 20s, and 30s, we could see the expansion of imperialistic ruling of Japan, and with that, the import and export structure had also changed. I think we can describe this process as Japan's translation or into the imperialistic industry state. And in the course of this transition, a lot of Korean people and Jeju Islanders were used as a labor force in the process of Japanese imperialistic industrialization. There is this direct sea route that linked Jeju Island and Osaka, and the ship Kimigayo Maru was used to travel people and ship people to and from Jeju and Osaka. And with this ship, the movement of these Jeju Islanders and the Japanese people changed. So 250,000 were the entire population of Jeju back then, but 1/5 of them, so basically 50,000 of them, moved to Japan, and 75% of the population that moved to Japan was working in Osaka. Back then, Osaka was dubbed as the Manchester in Eastern world. It was very famous for its cotton and textile industry. Imperialistic expansion of Japan allowed Osaka to develop into a hub of cotton and textile manufacturing, and this was possible because labor sources were being provided by the Jeju Islanders. Back then, Jeju Islands had to face the extortion and the violence of the modern capitalism and the colonialism. And also at the same time, they could realize the power of modernity. I think this bred the spirit of resistance which gave birth to the April 3rd incident. Then, right after Japan lost the war, and the background of liberation, how did this April 3rd incident unfold? Let me elaborate. If you look at the Korean history, against the liberation background, I think this has direct relation to April 3rd incident. And about that, I think I have a lot more experts here in this room. A lot of Koreans and a lot of Jetlanders would be a lot more familiar with this issue than myself. So I'll be brief here. But my point is that the Soviet imperialism and the US imperialism was at play. And I want to touch upon the impact Japanese colonialism left here in the Jeju Islands. After Japan lost the war, Korea was liberated and tried to establish an independent country centering around Yeonhyung. The Committee for the Preparation of the Korean Independence was formed by 16th of August, and at the end of August, 145 offices were established. And the guard organization or security keeping organization was established as well. Back then, many independence fighters were not yet back to the Korean peninsula, so it was not the point where we had a unified or united independence movement. However, despite that, on 6th of September, the establishment of the Joseon People's Committee was declared. So historically speaking, we can say that the entire process was moving so fast, and this process was enabled by and interfered by the United States and Russia. In the northern area, Soviet came in as a liberating army and tried to rule the area up there in an indirect manner. But then, Kim Il-sung returned from Soviet Union to Korea. And with the link between Kim Il-sung and Soviet Union, the rapid socialistic reform took place in the northern part of the Korean peninsula. And rapid land reform took place. There were diverse opinions regarding land reform, and those who were complaining about the land reform came down to the southern part of the Korean peninsula. Then what was happening in the southern part of the Korean peninsula? As a winner of the war, the Allied force of the United States came into the Korean peninsula and directly started ruling the southern part of the Korean peninsula. The US military government was established, and this military government of the United States hired a lot of people who were part of the general government of Japanese because what they cared for was the efficient ruling. You can see Lee Seung-man, who returned to the Korean peninsula in the picture, and Lee Seung-man tried to grasp power working with the United States. What I'm trying to point out here is that the interference of the Soviet Union and the United States happened like this, and this has culminated into the massacre that we are all familiar of. In 1946, the National Guard of the Southern Joseon was established, and centering around the Japanese military army and those officers from the Manchukuo became the center of establishing this National Guard. And a lot of people resisted to this, and with that, Daegu civil riot took place in October 1946. And it is said that 2.3 million people were hurt in the crackdown. The military and the police cracked down those who were not happy about the military governance, and this kind of exacerbated the conflict. And by March 1947, the Truman Doctrine was announced, and the United States military government wanted to strengthen their anti-communist maneuver. And against this backdrop, the South Korean election took place in the 1948, and in protest to this South Korea's only election, the protests began, and this led to the very brutal crackdown. What I'm trying to say here is that this brutal crackdown came from the pro-Japanese group and the anti-communist movement of the United States and a lot of people who was opposed to the idea of communism. The anti-communism and the colonialism led to the brutal crackdown and the massacre. And this violence and the colonialism were combined in the worst way to lead to the April 3rd incident. Then how exactly did it unfold itself in the background of East Asian history? The Korean War actually gave a big opportunity for Japan and helped Japan to recover after the war. This is a well-known fact, but there is one hidden unknown fact. There is the compensation thing, and this compensation was conditioned by the San Francisco Reconciliation Treaty. And here in this treaty, the colonized entities were not invited. And that is why the forced conscription and the Japanese sex labor problem were not addressed in this compensation issue. And also, the compensation was provided in the form of products, not in the form of cash. And from a Japanese industry point of view, this was a priming motor to develop their industry further. Previously colonized area were being established as an independent state, and with that, the US and the United Kingdom withdrew from this region. Then, in this void and in this vacuum, how did Japan come in? I'm showing you this table regarding the compensation after the war. If you look at the bottom row, you can see an amount of money which is 100 times larger than the national budget. And looking at this, you can see how the Japanese government was working. Back then, a personnel in charge of compensation said this. If you can see what is written in red, back then, the emerging countries in Southeast Asia, from the economic cooperation perspective, was the best and most attractive destination. However, to get there, the safest way for us to get there is to link our entry with the pretense of compensation. And this concept of compensation, more accurately, the pretense of compensation led to the ODA. And starting from the 1950s to 1970s, it was like pro-United States long-term ruling that was taking place in all over the East Asia. You can see the name of these countries, and all these names means that the countries that were pro to the United States and anti-communist. And in this region, we enter the era of war and massacre in East Asian history. If you look at the number of people who died during this period, of course, the number of the tallies differ country by country, but this number shows that the violence continued after the colonization and imperialism, and this got even worse. And if you look at this graph, this is the number of deaths who died in the armed conflict after the Second World War, and those in orange are all from Asia. That means a huge amount of people died in Asia. That means I would like to say that the April 3rd incident was the beginning point of this massive slaughter that took place in Asia. And here I just want to note and remind you of the massacre that took place in Indonesia. There was a military coup, and there, in the protests against the military coup and military government, more than 2 million people died. Then, how did Japan interfere with this government? Back then, Japanese government was there in Indonesia with backed up by the massive amount of money and capital. And this massacre was put into novel, and this was covered by Japanese NHK as well. Even in Indonesia, after 50 years, people barely start to talk about the incident now. The war, the history of massacre and violence. And I think the history began with the April 3rd incident in Jeju. That would be my final point. To conclude, in East Asia, we had a lot of damages and sacrifices and consequences of the wars and the conflicts and confrontation. And here in this Jeju, we are shedding new light to these and trying to heal the past wounds. And I think Jeju is certainly a leader in this regard in the world. If you look back, the 20th century was the era of war and violence, but I think we have to move toward peace and coexistence in the 21st century, and that means we need a turning point. If we can achieve a turning point, that would be a good thing. And I think this Jeju Forum can become a great turning point for us to march towards coexistence and cooperation, reconciliation. Thank you.
선생님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁.
So let's give another round of applause to Professor Nakano Toshio, who flew all the way from Japan to give us this talk. Thank you very much, Professor. Now, we're going to invite today's speaker and discussants. So, Mr. Ha Ho-jun, Professor John Epperjesip, and Professor Moon Kyung-soo and Professor Kim Min-han, would you all join us here on stage?
정치학 박사로 현재 사상
Ha Ho-jun from Hangyeole will be the moderator for this session. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Mr. Ha Ho-jun. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be able to chair this session, which is hosted by Jeju April 3 Research Institute. My name is Ha Ho-jun of Hangyeole. Among the 66 sessions of Jeju Forum, this is going to be the last session. And that shows the importance of April 3rd incident in Jeju Forum. In Jeju Forum has a history of 20 years, and I believe that the April 3rd incident has never been given so much importance as today. We have about 80 minutes, so we have to finish the presentation and discussion within that given time. And before we begin with the presentation, I would like to summarize the keynote by Professor Nakano.
We found out the link between the imperialism and the April 3rd and tried to look at the April 3rd incident in the context of East Asian history. Looking at this wonderful presentation, I think we are given a new research topic. Thank you for being here and giving us a great lecture. Please give another big round of applause to the Professor Nakano. We would like to move on to the presentation and the discussion. Let me introduce our speaker and the discussants. We have Professor John Epperjesip from Kyunghee University. Professor Epperjesip is studying American militarism, and in 2021, he released a paper, and he wrote a paper which looked into the deep implication of the April 3rd incident. And he is constantly asking other U.S. scholars to teach April 3rd incident in universities. And he is staying in Jeju for several days to give a lecture here, and he also paid a visit to a lot of bereaved families of the April 3rd incident. Thank you. Next, we have Professor Emeritus Moon Kyung-soo of Ritsumeikan University. He's also from Jeju, and he's a second generation of the Japanese Korean immigrants. He also has studied April 3rd incident for a very long time. And last but not least, we have Associate Professor Kim Min-hwan of Hanshin University. Professor Kim is researching Okinawa War and the Taiwanese War and also the April 3rd incident. And he conducted a comparison study looking at the process of building Peace Park, Pacific Rim Peace Park in Korea, in Jeju. And with that, we would like to invite Professor Epperjesi for his speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is my first time attending the Jeju Forum, and I hope it's the first of many. It's a really wonderful event. I just wanted to start off by thanking everyone from Governor Oh to the speakers, the discussants, all of the staff, all the people working on the computers and the cameras back there in the restaurant. An immense amount of labor goes into something like this, so I'm really, really impressed. It's a beautiful event. Let's see, I would also like to thank Han Jin-hee, the head of administration at the 4-3 Research Institute, for organizing my visit. I sent her 1 million cacao messages trying to get everything organized, and she patiently responded to them. I changed my hotel at the last minute. So thank you so much for all of your help. I would like to also especially thank Mr. Ha Ho-jun. For 30 years, the past 30 years, he's dedicated his life to doing research that would lead to truth and justice for the people of Jeju. The product of that research is this incredibly important book that was just translated into English, American Involvement in the Jeju April 3 Incident. I'm going to do everything I can to help promote this book amongst scholars in the US and around the world. It's a major contribution. The NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said that when you're young, you really need role models. He said when you get older, you still need role models. So I'd like to say that Mr. Hall is a role model for me, an inspiration for somebody who's really dedicated his life. Could we please give a hand to him? Finally, I'd like to thank all of the students, activists, and journalists in the past who fought to make it possible for someone like me and for all of us to speak publicly about the April 3 incident. We can't take that for granted. So I have deep respect for their efforts, for the creation of the Sasam Research Foundation, and I'm really, really honored to be able to contribute to it today. So I'm not an expert or authority on the April 3 incident. The more I read and learn about this history, the more I realize how little I actually know. So in my talk today, I'll reflect on how this history connects to the history of US imperialism, a connection that is only beginning to be explored by academics outside the field of Korean studies. Sasam is absent from most histories of the Cold War, both academic and popular. There's nothing about Jeju in the Wikipedia entry for Cold War. And I think that's awful. That needs to be rectified. And that's something I want to try to work on when I go back to Seoul. Sasam is absent from the field of American studies, which is my academic background. This absenteeing of Sasam is a form of violence, the violence of forgetting. And as the 75th anniversary of the uprising and massacre approaches, I hope there can be a worlding of the April 3 incident in which scholars, artists, activists, students, and concerned citizens around the planet learn about this history and reflect on how it relates to their own struggles. So I use the term worlding, but I think globalization of April 3 incident is better. So thank you, Governor O. When I go home and revise this, I'm going to replace worlding with globalization. I think it sounds better. But worlding or globalization can be understood as the process through which local communities come together to create transnational forms of solidarity and cooperation that are especially urgent right now as the United States, China, and Russia are entangling the planet in a new Cold War. And it's kind of mind-blowing to hear this expression, new Cold War. The old Cold War isn't over yet. So why don't we kind of end the old Cold War first and then take a break before starting a new Cold War? Or maybe, no more Cold Wars. The people of Jeju know exactly what the Cold War looked and felt like, and their stories need to be heard. Therefore, I'd like to begin my talk with the words of Kong Suk-ja, who was born in 1938 and lived in Bonggae Village, Jeju Township, in 1948. Grandmother Kong tells her life story in the Jeju April 3 incident through women's eyes. Jeju women tell their stories, a collection of survivor testimonies published by the 4-3 Research Institute and recently translated into English. This book changed me. I've been reading histories of the April 3 incident, lots of numbers, statistics, dates. It's very abstract. But when I read this book and I read their stories, I cried a lot. I was extremely angry. And I can understand Mr. Ho's dedication. When you read survivor testimonies, it changes you. We all need to listen carefully to the voices of these strong grandmothers who, as children, suffered through the first major conflict of the Cold War under a US military occupation. Grandmother Kong says, "Just thinking about the Jeju April 3 incident makes my blood boil. My immediate family members died in the incident. My cousin died in all her beauty. I'm just furious. How could innocent people be killed like that? It's disgusting." Now, Grandmother Kong and I might not have a lot in common, but like her, thinking about the Jeju April 3 incident makes my blood boil. When I hear these stories about young girls seeing their fathers arrested, tortured, and disappeared, their homes burned to the ground, their fellow villagers savagely speared and burned to death, their younger siblings dying of starvation, which is what happened to Hong Chun-ho. I met Grandmother Hong this summer. I went on a tour with her and she showed me her village, Mudungiwat, which was burned. She told me about her life in the village before Sasam, playing with her friends, playing a game called Seigakshi, like the bride game, or in English similar to playing house, riding horses, shooting arrows. It was really beautiful. It was pastoral in American studies. It was just very kind of beautiful and calm. She lost her 3 younger brothers. They died of starvation after their village was burned. The family then lived in a series of caves. This picture is outside Konolgwe Cave, where they lived for 50 days. When I hear her story, I'm disgusted and heartbroken. I would like to try to answer Grandmother Kong's important question: how can innocent people be killed like that? What happened on Jeju Island between 1947 and 1954 was extraordinary. Between 25 and 30,000 people were killed, or 1/10 of the population. 1/3 of the victims were elderly, women, or children. 95% of mountain villages were burned. Between 80,000 and 90,000 people living in mountain villages were forcibly relocated. 3,994 people were disappeared. But while the terror and violence that swept over Jeju Island after liberation from Japan was extraordinary in relation to the history of Jeju, in relation to United States history, it's not extraordinary. It's actually quite ordinary. As the United States emerged from scattered European colonies in the 17th century, and then expanded across the North American continent and the Pacific into a global empire, the massacre of civilians, Native Americans, Filipinos, Koreans, Japanese, Vietnamese, has been a regular feature of that expansion. Scorched earth, unlimited air war, napalm, torture, internment camps, and mass shootings. There have been 471 mass shootings in the United States in 2022. All of this mass violence is as American as apple pie. So to answer Grandmother Kong's question, how could innocent people be killed like that? I would like to give a brief tour through the history of United States imperialism, focusing on a war in Southeast Asia, the Philippine-American War, that resembles in many ways the Jeju April 3 incident, while also talking a bit about my own academic work and how I became interested in this history. When I was starting out in graduate school in the early 1990s, the text in one of my seminars included this advertisement for Pear's soap that appeared in Harper's Weekly in 1899. The step toward lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Like most people, I found this advertisement racist and disgusting, but I had no idea who the uniformed white man washing his hands was, or which dark corner of the earth needed brightening. The white man with a burden is Admiral George Dewey, who led the US Navy in the Spanish-American War, a war that helped liberate Cubans and Filipinos from a corrupt and oppressive Spanish empire. I almost said Japanese. But which quickly turned into a Philippine-American War. I remember thinking, Philippine-American what? I had never heard about any war between the United States and the Philippines. My interest in the history of US imperialism began at this moment with a desire to learn more about this forgotten war. Emilio Aguinaldo led Philippine forces against the Spanish during the Philippine Revolution in 1896, 1897, and believed that the United States was coming to fight for Philippine independence. On July 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared an independent Philippine Republic. Yet the US refused to recognize this republic and proceeded to take over where Spain left off, thus leading to a counter-revolutionary war against a people who had suffered and struggled against a violently corrupt Spanish empire for 300 years. The war officially ended in 1902, but fighting continued until 2013. After 300 years of Spanish colonialism, liberation should have been a time of joy and celebration for Filipinos. But instead of people dancing in the streets, there were massacres, scorched earth, water torture, and concentration camps that turned the Philippines into an archipelago of suffering and death. An estimated 200,000 Filipinos died from violence, famine, and disease, though some scholars put the number over 1 million. My interest in this forgotten war evolved into a book, which is focused on the 1890s, the period in which the United States seized colonies in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Samoa, in order to contain a rising Japanese empire and create stepping stones to the mythical China market that was believed to be the solution to the economic crises which were rocking the United States at that time. I believe that the Jeju April 3 incident needs to be situated in the long history of US imperialist expansion into the Pacific and Asia, a process that began in part with the Wilkes naval expedition in 1838, accelerated in the 1890s, the age of empire, and exploded in the 20th century. The word imperialism appeared with increasing frequency in the mainstream media in the 1890s in the context of US expansion into Asia and the Pacific. By the middle of the 20th century, imperialism became a political curse word that the US and Soviet Union hurled at each other, and the decolonizing Third World hurled at the two superpowers. Anxiety about the charge of imperialism had a direct impact on the Jeju April 3 incident. As Ho Ho Jun demonstrates in his remarkable book, quote, "To ensure a successful election on May 10, the US military government had to quickly suppress the disturbance on Jeju. But directions were issued twice to Mansfield, the military governor on Jeju, stressing that US forces should not intervene. If the US military were to become directly involved in combat, that might escalate the uprising into an international issue and draw condemnation from the public. Accordingly, they were instructed not to be present at the scene of combat activities." Hall points out that US intervention in Jeju, as in the Greek Civil War, was carefully orchestrated so as not to be denounced for imperialism. He writes, "On orders from Hodge, US troops did not appear at the scene of activities. Instead, they played an invisible hand role in organizing all operational plans and implementing them by means of the constabulary. Unlike previous massacres in the history of US imperialism, Wounded Knee in 1890, the Moro or Bud Daho massacre in 1906, No Gun Ri in 1950, My Lai in 1968, Haditha massacre in 2005. The invisible hand of US troops did not pull the trigger on Jeju, but they did put powerful Garand rifles into Korean hands, did fly spotter planes to flush guerrillas out of hiding places on Mount Hala, did provide a naval blockade of the island so that news of the massacre could not enter global news circuits or even reach the mainland. And they did shell the coastline, which created further panic and drove people back into the mountains. As Hwang Soo-kyung points out, quote, "Just how much they were involved in the active violence in Jeju has not been fully disclosed, since the American presence was mostly on the fringes of the violence, as policy advisors, providers of resources, and detached overseers. The invisible hand and conflicts over the May 10 election need to be situated in the context of a new foreign policy regime that began to emerge in Washington in the mid-1940s. In June of 1947, a plan to help rebuild Western Europe after the destruction of World War II was announced. The Marshall Plan ultimately provided $12 billion in assistance to war-torn countries across the Atlantic and had a direct impact on US policy toward Korea. With massive resources being directed toward Europe, it was quickly becoming too expensive for the US military to stay in Korea. And as grassroots resistance to the military occupation intensified in the form of the October uprising of 1946, the United States needed to find a way to exit the country, quote, quickly and gracefully, as John Merrill put it in his 1980 article, the first article that was written, published in English about the April 3 incident. So that exit strategy was composed in part with another major foreign policy initiative that appeared in June of 1947, the Truman Doctrine, which in the long run has meant that the goal of US global foreign policy was to provide assistance to anti-communist regimes throughout the world, no matter how undemocratic, and for the creation of a set of global military alliances directed at the Soviet Union. The strategy of containment evolved out of the Truman Doctrine and led the US to sponsor separate elections in South Korea, through which the anti-communist Syngman Rhee would enable the US to exit the country quickly and gracefully, knowing that US interest in the region would be secure. All wars are fought twice, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Viet Thanh Nguyen writes. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. This is a really important book that was just translated into Korean. And I think it would be great, a really important resource for comparing the April 3 incident and memory over the American war in Vietnam. The voices included in the Jeju April 3 incident through women's eyes are an important contribution to the battle over memory. And I would therefore like to conclude with the voice of Jung Bong-young, who was born in 1934 and lived in Dodu Village, Jeju Township, during the uprising. In her story, Grandmother Jung reveals that her father was beaten and imprisoned multiple times until one day he didn't come home. It was reported, the one thing we know for sure is that my father passed away at sea, Grandmother Jung writes. When I read this awful description of people in shackles being loaded onto a Navy ship and thrown into the sea, drowned and disregarded, I immediately thought of a sculpture I show my students when we discuss the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade. This sculpture, entitled Vicissitudes, is by a British sculptor, Jason de Caires Taylor. In 2006, Mr. Taylor created the world's first underwater sculpture park, the Molinaire Bay Underwater Sculpture Park in the Caribbean off the coast of West Grenada. Taylor creates site-specific sculptures that are installed on the ocean floor and develop into artificial reefs, which have a symbiotic relationship, both to local communities and to marine life. When I look at that sculpture, I also think of the 250 students from Dan Wan High School who died in the criminal sinking of the Sewol Ferry. The circular image of strength and mutual aid also reminded me of another important symbol. Just as the children are holding hands and supporting each other amid harsh ocean currents, the petals of the camellia are tightly interlaced, supporting each other as they face harsh winds that sweep over the island. Professor Gui-Suk Guan explained to me that this symbol originated from Kang Yo-bae's 1991 exhibition, The Camellia Has Fallen, in which petals represent the souls of the victims of Sasam who were lost without a sound to this cold, snow-covered ground. I believe that justice for the people of Jeju involves the globalization of the April 3 incident, which means engaging the silence of the United States government while raising international awareness about this ongoing history. Jeju Island was one of the first battlefields in which the Truman Doctrine and the strategy of containment were put to the test, a test that was written in Korean blood. In the following decades, that test would be written in the blood of millions of people in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. As the 75th anniversary of the April 3 incident approaches, I believe the time has come for the United States to make an official apology to the people of Jeju Island for its role in the bloodshed that devastated the island between 1947 and 1954. The United States needs to hear and understand Grandmother Kong's question. How could so many innocent people be killed like that? Thank you.
FJC 교수
Thank you for the wonderful speech, and I'm so flattered by what he said about me. I think we are a little behind the schedule. So as for discussions, I think I can give you 7 minutes. And Professor Emeritus Moon, please go ahead. Hello, I am Moon Kyung-soo, as was just introduced. I have many greetings to say because it's my first time in Jeju after several years, but because of the timing constraint, I will skip and I will just read along my discussion paper. Please refer to the page 43 of the booklet. And starting from the second paragraph. When contemplating the complete resolution of April 3rd, the responsibility of the United States would emerge as one of the key topics in the context of worlding of April 3rd. And in this regard, Professor Eberje's presentation in this session is considered an excellent achievement. Based on the question raised by Professor Eberje, I would like to fulfill my humble role as a panelist by suggesting a topic to discuss with 3 key words. And worlding in an academic sense, it was a inspiration for me to write this discussion paper. Please note that. Usually discussions on U.S. responsibility for the tragedy of the April 3rd are implicitly premised on the notions of the impulse and barbarism of imperialism and the view that the U.S., which appeared in Northeast Asia as an empire to replace Japan after the Second World War, it had ambitions to dominate the Korean Peninsula and suppressed the resident people. And in this regard, I think Professor Eberje's referring of the U.S. invasion in the Philippines replacing Spain was really relevant. However, at the same time, just like he pointed out, citing the achievements of Dr. Ho-Ho-jun or Dr. John Merrill, the interference of the United States regarding April 3rd is conducted in the form of invisible hands. So it stayed in the periphery of violence, and also, rather than ruling in the Korean Peninsula, unlike it did in the Philippines, to quote, the United States focused on finding a way to exit Korea quickly and gracefully. So the U.S. policy on the Korean Peninsula is nothing like the U.S. policy on the Philippines. So is it the same concept expressed in different forms, or is it that the concept itself transformed? That is one question I wanted to ask. And when it comes to the Cold War, it would be possible to point out a similar thing. About the U.S. policy around April 3rd, Dr. Ho-Ho-jun and Dr. Ho Sang-soo have been making a lot of research achievements. And 2 doctors agree that the beginning of the Cold War is the Truman Doctrine of March 1947 and says that April 3rd is one part of the anti-communist Cold War policy. And I think the presentation we just heard is in line with this. And I think that putting April 3rd in the context of Cold War is almost like a common sense when you study April 3rd. However, this is in conflict when you think about the fact that the United States, when withdrawing from the Korean Peninsula, it only left Korean Military Advisory Group and decided to withdraw all the United States forces to Korea. As you're well aware, by January 1950, the State Secretary Dean Acheson of the United States said that the American defense line in the Pacific was one that connected the Philippines, Okinawa, the Japanese archipelago, and the Aleutians, and it does not bear responsibility or hold accountability over regions outside of this. Was this merely a fake? Should we view this as a fake or feint of the United States? The international post-Cold War studies moves from traditionalism, which tries to hold Soviet Union accountable, and moves to the trend to tries to hold the US accountable, which is revisionism. And starting from the end of the 1980s, we move to hold both the Soviet Union and the United States accountable, which is post-revisionism. And after that, the studies of the Cold War history try to focus on the cultural turn or the transnational turn, which highlights the cultural aspect of the Cold War. However, if you look at the past existing documents, we could find out facts about the Cold War when we were in the phase of post-revisionism. So by the 1980s, we could grasp the factual evidence of the Cold War. And based on the fact that we can find from the existing documents from the Soviet Union and the East Asia, about the beginning of the Cold War in East Asia, it seems that it began from the US-Soviet agreement on the post-war treatment of China, or the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, or even later, the start of the Korean War sometimes. One of the most representative figure in the post-revisionism is John Lewis Geddes. And he said that nor US or Soviet Union had this life or death interest over the Asian continent, and they were happy to acknowledge the Kuomintang of China as a ruling party over this region. And to cite Geddes, to quote Geddes, by 1949, Cold War didn't reach Asian continents, and by 1949, he meant when Chiang Kai-shek was kicked out of China. But then, one similarity was found in terms of the function of the imperialistic state established in the Europe, and that was Eurocentrism. That is why everybody was shocked to see the expansion of the Cold War reaching to the Asian continent. About the starting point of the Cold War, we have to make a good discussion about this because this is in line with the argument that we have to focus on the internal dynamism of the April 3rd incident. When we talk about the worlding of the April 3rd incident, I think it is important for us to reach consensus when it comes to academic studies of April 3rd or the academic trends by communicating with researchers all over the world and having more dialogue to find the truth behind the April 3rd. And I hope that this event help us boost such communication in academic scenes. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Moon, thank you. I think he asked very provocative questions, and Professor Epperger's answer can be given after the next discussion has made his discussion. So, Professor Kim Mina, would you keep it short? I think you could take off your mask, and I will read the paper that I have prepared. And it's my honor to participate with many respected researchers in the Jeju Forum session resolving Korea's past history, Jeju 4, April 3, and international solidarity, efforts for peace and coexistence. I was supposed to discuss Professor Epperjes's presentation today, but I would like to express my pleasure at seeing Professor Nakano Toshio here today, who have given a speech, keynote speech during this session. By the time I began my research on Jeju April 3, the Battle of Okinawa and the subsequent violence committed by the U.S. military personnel and Taiwan's 228 incident, where Professor Nakano taught me that the peaceful post-war era of Japan was premised on the non-peaceful war violence and suffering in the former Japanese colonies. This lesson I learned from him and had a significant influence on me in shaping my research framework. Professor Epperjes related to the history of atrocious and gruesome violence that American imperialism has committed since the late 19th century in the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Samoa, Jeju, Vietnam, and Iraq. In particular, it roused a sense of deja vu for Koreans in that after 300 years of Spanish colonialism, liberation should have been a time of joy and celebration for Filipinos, while the U.S. military instead brought about massacres, scorched the earth, water torture, and concentration camp. I learned a lot from his positioning of Jeju April 3rd in the diachronic context of expanded U.S. imperialism. And Professor Epperjes has also related the characteristics of Jeju April 3rd, which are clearly distinct from other imperialistic violence committed by the U.S. military. This is well described in his statement, the invisible hand of U.S. troops did not pull the trigger in Jeju, but it did, that is in Jeju, but it did put powerful Garand rifles into Korean hands, did fly spotter planes to flush guerrillas out of hiding places on Mount Hala, did provide a neighbor a blockade of the island so that news of the massacre could not reach mainland Korea or global news circuits, and did shell coastline, which created further panic and drove people back into the mountains. I would like to put more emphasis on the said characteristics of Jeju April 3 by connecting concurrent events in other parts of East Asia with Jeju April 3. In other words, I would take a synchronic approach, different from Professor Epperjes's one. And during a similar time in East Asia, where there were some incidents, and I think it would be quite interesting to talk about them. And Dr. Ho-Jun, I think, has similar ideas as I, and he compared the Korea and Jeju cases in his doctoral thesis. And in the thesis, he links Jeju April 3 with the event that took place in Greece, which featured core geopolitical conditions that were similar to those of Korea, or more specifically Jeju, in the aspect of containment to prevent communism amid the global outbreak of the Cold War. And by doing so, it provides a crucial insight concerning the worldling or globalization of Jeju April 3. And Professor mentioned Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. But in Okinawa and Taiwan, I mean, I worry about the future of these regions or countries. And Okinawa and Taiwan, well, geopolitically, they have similarities. And so, and these archipelago in East Asia were key places to contain China. And I have made an effort to construe the reason why the United States Army military government and the South Korean government massacred Jeju residents so brutally and methodically during Jeju April 3. I came to the conclusion that a very important reason was that if Jeju Island had turned red, it would have been impossible to contain China. And that is same true of Okinawa and Taiwan. These regions had to be perfectly controlled by the U.S. military or by its allied forces. And that is why both Okinawa and Taiwan experienced violence featuring the same characteristics as those of Jeju April 3 at around the same time. And these three islands have a few other things in common. When the boundaries of a nation state are drawn, a border area is also created. This condition in itself leads to violent situations, and I refer to them as the violent context caused due to the separation of living zones. And Jeju, well, as Professor Nakano had said, there were connections previously with Osaka and Jeju. However, that was separated. And that also led to, I believe, very sad incidents. And there has to be internal pacification. And so, social, scientifically, this is a rather a normal word. And the general process may involve direct physical violence, but it is not highly emphasized. This is because the process aims to unify laws and administrative systems. Up to this point, it would be regarded as typical violence that is derived from drawing physical border lines. And the brutality of violence that Jeju or Okinawa and Taiwan experienced was generated when the invisible psychological border resulting from the violence due to a physical borderline was combined with the elimination of non-citizens, which is a Cold War related factors. So the aspects of containment policies to prevent communism, counterinsurgency against the border areas, and elimination of non-citizens commonly applied to Jeju, Okinawa, and Taiwan around the same period brought about the gruesome violence in the three regions. This is my tentative hypothesis. The problem is that the structure that led to this violence has not completely disappeared. We should pay particular attention to the current situation where the issue of containing China is being re-emphasized. China has offered a hypothetical deadline for the Chinese Navy to break through the U.S. containment border and secure it as its operational zone by 2025. The so-called first island chain is situated in waters across Jeju, Okinawa, and Taiwan. To break through this line by the United States and its allies, China has carried out obstinate territorial disputes against South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And when the Ukrainian war broke out, the issue of China's possible invasion of Taiwan came up at the same time. And I fear that if the order in this region, which was created by violence in Jeju, Okinawa, and Taiwan, fluctuates in a violent and of course manner, the areas where the direct and severe damage will be concentrated will highly likely to be Jeju, Okinawa, and Taiwan as in the past. And since the mid-late to late 1990s, people have paid attention to the linkage between East Asian regions, while the victims of the state violence in Okinawa, Taiwan, and Jeju have formed a solidarity. And the formerly isolated anti-military base and peace movement have recognized each other, building solidarity. And finally, I would like to discuss, talk about the Moliner Bay Underwater Sculpture Park. I agree his consciousness of the problem. There was Jung Hyang-shin, who turned last year's memorial ceremony of Jeju April 3 into Sea of Tears by speaking with the topic that my mother doesn't eat fish. So with that, I would like to conclude my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Actually, our time is up. I think we were given 3 more extra time. About the answers to the questions raised during the discussion, I think we have to answer them after the session is over. Under these diverse topics of April 3rd in the United States and Japan, we are here. We have talked about the possibility of international solidarity in terms of finding truth behind April 3rd, just like put by Nakano, Professor Nakano. By finding the truth behind massacre, we have to translate the link between the imperialistic and the colonialism into the link for the justice. And we have to fight against the silence of the United States, as was put by Professor Percy. And as you're well aware, next year will mark the 43rd anniversary of the Jeju 3rd incident. I think it is now time for us for Jeju to receive official apology from the Japan and America, and I hope that they can listen to the voices of the Jeju Islanders. In conclusion, I would like to thank all our keynote speaker, Professor Nakano Toshio, our speaker, John Eppershi Professor, and our discussants. And with that, I will pass my microphone over back to the MC today. Thank you. To wrap up, we would like to invite President of Jeju Peace Institute for the final remark.
네, 내외 귀빈 여러분.
Ladies and gentlemen, over the last 3 years, under the topic of beyond conflict towards peace, coexistence, and cooperation, we had a heated discussion. And after this 3-day-long discussion, we are now enjoying the final evening of the forum. The great invention that changed the course of the human history, as you are well aware, didn't come to us thanks to a lonely genius. The great inventions of our times and of the human history happen when many stakeholders cooperate and compete and thus enhance collective intellectual capacity and capability. And researchers call this collective intelligence. Historically, the collective intelligence has been the driving force and the prerequisite for the major invention and innovation. And going one step further, I would like to say that the generation of collective intelligence is the driving force and the prerequisite for peace and prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, the Korean Peninsula and Asia is one of the most dynamic regions in the world. Unprecedented rapid growth and the sudden economic crisis show us that Asia is dynamic yet unstable. And also, as we can see from the North Korean nuclear crisis in Asia, the security concerns are ever present. To address this dynamism and uncertainty of Asia effectively, of course, we need the efforts of individual countries, but on top of that, we need international cooperation based on the active and creative collective intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, after its establishment in 2001, Jeju Peace Forum has served as a platform of dialogue and cooperation for peace and prosperity. And over the last 3 years, global leaders and experts from all across the countries were invited together to have a heated discussion and presentation about politics, economics, security, culture, and history. The participants reviewed existing ideas and suggested new ideas. And thanks to all these efforts, here in this Jeju, I believe that we have given birth to collective intelligence that can ease conflict and enhance peace through coexistence and cooperation. And I believe that this collective intelligence that we created here will be a driving force and the prerequisite for the international cooperation for peace and prosperity going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the biggest leading agent of this forum is you. As moderators, as speakers, discussants, and audience members, you have discussed creative ideas and practical ways for peace and prosperity. And I believe that you can give birth to collective intelligence for Asia and further develop it. On this occasion, I would like to thank each and every one of you and the organizations who helped us for the successful operation of this forum. And I also would like to thank our sponsors for their generous support. And my special thanks goes to the Jeju residents, of course. I hope that we can further develop this Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity to discuss even more and diverse topics and invite even more participants. I ask for your support and cooperation in this regard. Last but not least, I know that all of you are busy, but please do take some time to enjoy the beauty of Jeju, the World Natural Heritage Site. I hope you have a safe flight back home, and I sincerely hope that we can meet you again next year in the 18th Jeju Forum. Thank you. Thank you. With that, we would like to wrap up the Resolving Korea's Past History, Jeju, April 3rd, and International Solidarity Efforts for Peace and Coexistence session. Thank you for staying with us till the end.